Hot button.
I'm gonna go online and order the Genesis Mini.
Oh, really?
Right now, because I want to play Genesis.
How much is it?
Hey, $80.
What games are on this so far?
Echo the Dolphin, Castlevania Bloodlines, Space Harrier 2, Shining Force, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, Toe Jam and Earl, Comic Zone, Sonic, Altered Beast, Gunstar Heroes. That's all that's announced
It's
so
not
far.
bad. So
It's about
Comp? No, wait, they announced more.
Wave 2, Earthworm Jim,
Yeah.
Mickey's Castle of Illusion, fuck yeah, Shinobi 3, Contra Hardcore, Sonic 2, Mickey World of Illusion, Thunder Force 3, Super Fantasy Zone, Streets of Rage 2, and Landstalker.
Streets of Rage 2.
Purchase?
You bought it?
Yeah.
It doesn't come out till September.
I know, you guys, this is what you do to me.
Well, if it's anything like the Nintendo ones, it'll get canceled because they won't be able to keep up with demand.
Or it could be like the PlayStation one where I just spent $80 on something that's going to cost $5 in 3 months.
Yeah.
Who knows?
That too. All right, so this is Hot Button, and I'm Randall Beatrice, here as always with Austin Blakesley
Yeah.
and host Chris Antuano.
I'm the host this time again.
It's true.
Damn, who's that impression of me or Randy?
Yeah, that's both of us.
Yes, you're inevitably ugly love child.
What do you mean inevitable?
I see you guys touching each other under the table right here.
No, those are the legs of the thing.
Footsies.
No, you can't even.
Footsies.
No.
We can make a podcast of audio of me kicking Austin in the knee. It happens so many times. I'm just
we all
too
have bands
fidgety.
on.
That's because I always cross my legs like this, and so do you, but we do it opposite.
Yeah.
So you're always kicking me
I'm
in the
sitting
knee.
on my legs right now. All right, so this is part 2 of our Sega Saga on like their venture into the home console space.
Sega Saga, nice, dude. That's good.
That's my shit.
I said that on the last
That's good.
I'll keep saying it over and over.
Oh, don't ruin it. Say it 5 times fast. Sega Saga, Sega Saga, Sega Saga, Sega Saga.
And that's how everybody.
This has been part 2. Join us for part 3 where we come up with another bit for 5 seconds and then quit.
But before we get to their inevitable downfall, let's jump back into where are we? What year? Where they're trucking?
All right. Well, where we last left off, they had put out the SG-1000, the SG-1002, the Master System,
the Mark III,
the Mega Drive, and they put out the Genesis, which had a lot of success in
And the jukebox.
North America, and the jukebox. Yeah. So now we're gonna get on to what happens next.
Yeah.
So I mentioned they were leapfrogging. Real quick, I don't know anything about computers. Mine barely works. So I'm gonna get Austin. Could you kind of do like a brief explanation about what bits are? Because 16-bit, 8-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit gaming, all this is going to come up a whole lot now.
And the marketing in this era was literally what number's bigger. Like, do you ever see ads?
Yeah.
Like TV?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
so Randy's hinting at what I
so
wanted
funny.
to talk about this because it's very funny. So a bit in computing is the foundation of how everything works. Basically, if you don't know, computers talk to parts of each other with ones and zeros. That 1 or 0 is known as a bit. And that's all binary.
What about quantum computers?
I don't know, dude. I didn't go to college for that. And it's all done in binary. So basically, back in the old days, we're talking about room computers with giant vacuum tubes.
Like the mainframes
Yes.
that are...
Basically, they had transistors, and it would you would run electricity through a transistor and light it up. And that would determine whether a certain function of the computer was on or off, which is where binary came from. So 1 tends to mean on, 0 tends to mean off. And then they were like, we want to make a computer that can add up numbers. And they made something that took up like an entire like skyscraper worth, and it could add like 3 to 4. And then they're like, wait a minute. In order to do anything, we need to be able to add much bigger numbers. So then they started adding more transistors. And
What do you think those computers are now?
This. My phone. So basically, for video games, for processors, a bit is how many numbers it can deal with at a time. So the way binary works is it's base 1 instead of base 10. So like if I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the first digit becomes 0 again. The next digit has a 1 in it. And then the first digit is how many singles, how many ones are in the number. The second digit is how many tens, then how many hundreds. Binary works the same way, but it's base 2. Sorry, not base 1. So basically the first digit is how many ones are in it, and then how many twos, and then 4s, 8, 16, 32. So it's like the number 8, for example, in binary is 1000 because there's 1 8 in it, 0 4 0 2 0 1s. So 8-bit, what that means is that everything in the system can only be stored in 8 bits, which, if you know anything about binary, that's 8 numbers that goes from 0 to 255.
Right, 256 is the...
Yes, 256 is to it. That's why in the original Zelda, you can only hold 255 rupees.
Right.
So in terms of gaming, it can come in one of a number of ways. In games like Mega Man, for example, you know how it would like flicker?
Yeah.
So you could only have... the thing would render the screen in something called scan lines.
Okay.
And each scan line could only have a certain number of sprites rendered onto it at a time, based on how many...
That's where you would get the
based on how
effect,
many the memory could hold, because the memory was all 8 by 8 squares of pixels,
Right.
because it was 8-bit, and then it could only hold like 8 or like 4, I think, sprites per line. So like if you jump up and Mega Man fires 2 bullets, and
Yeah.
Mega Man's face was 1 sprite and his body was another sprite, because you could only have 4 colors per each
Occupy
sprite.
the same-
So you could have a peach-colored face and a blue-colored suit. So they were 2 separate sprites, plus the 2 bullets, plus an enemy. The enemy would flicker
Yeah.
with Mega Man, because each frame would be rendering Mega Man or the enemy, because you could only render a certain amount
Right,
per scan line.
You would see
that's-
that flickering a
That's
lot.
where flickering came
That's
from.
funny. It's even funny now in emulation that stuff is
Yes,
still there.
yeah.
I think the Mario games, the timer starts at 255 seconds.
Yes,
like I think
exactly.
every level, yeah. That's so funny.
And then there's another thing, which is 8-bit color depth. So it's like part of an NES game stores what colors the game could use.
Right.
So
yeah, different games had different palettes. Like,
yes,
yeah.
because you had 255 colors available to you,
Right.
but you could only use 4 per sprite because of the way the memory limitations worked. So that's why when you moved from the Nintendo to the Super Nintendo, games got more colorful, because they were
Yeah,
able to hold
totally.
16 bits worth of... so 8-bit was 255. 16 bits was 2 to the 16th, or a max value of 65,536.
That's quite a significant jump.
So that's what a significant jump. And then you get into 32 bits, which is insanely higher. It's something in the 4 billions.
Then
No, sorry.
The math is exponential.
Yeah.
every time.
2,147,483,647, and then you get to 64-bit,
64-bit.
which is whoa.
was
So-
128 maybe the last time bits were referenced? Maybe.
So here's the funny thing. In terms of gaming, they didn't know how to market games when like the NES was like a thing. I mean, like people
Yeah.
bought them because they were toys, but they were like, yeah, it's got 8-bit processing power, and everybody's like, oh. And then Genesis came out, and they were like, this has got 16 bits of processing power. It was like,
That's twice as many bits.
that's double the bits.
Yeah.
So then, like, what Chris is about to get into, they started this whole war.
Bit war.
Where they're like, yo, yeah, well, the Sega Saturn has 32 bits of processing power. And then
It's twice as
fucking
much as the SNES.
Nintendo 64 comes out, and they're like, it has 64 bits of processing power, even though it can't actually handle that, and it has a 32-bit bus, so it's the same thing. But our number's higher. And then, like, the GameCube came out, and I was like, it's got 128 bits. And it's like, no,
we're done with that,
it doesn't.
GameCube.
Because, you know, the computers that are sitting in front of us all right now are 64-bit.
Right. Yeah.
And
That's
the
why
reason-
the operating system.
The reason that Windows has 32-bit and 64-bit versions is because the memory address of your computer is stored as a number. And if it's a 32-bit number, then you can only hold that many max memory addresses,
Right.
which is why 32-bit versions of Windows can only maximally use 4 gigabytes of memory. So when you upgrade to 64-bit, all of a sudden they get to be able to use something like 256 gigabytes or 512 gigabytes of RAM, or it might even be in terabytes at that point. Like, it's exponentially higher.
So this stuff eventually kind of...
So it doesn't matter. Like, they talk about how, like, the Nintendo 64 is 64-bit. No, it wasn't. It had a 64-bit processor, but it couldn't use it because it was pointless. Yeah. Nobody had the use for that on that system.
I remember all those games on that platform.
The PlayStation 1,
perfect.
32 bits. The Xbox, 32 bits. The GameCube, 32 bits. Like, the processors themselves have always been 32 bits up until
like recently,
the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, and I'm pretty sure the Switch. But like, what they refer to when they say 32-bit, 16-bit, 8-bit is one of two things. It's either the memory limit of the console, which is how much they can render on screen at a time, how many backgrounds they can use, things like that, or the color depth. So it's like, that's the big...
Most of the time here, it's going to be the processing power, not the color depth.
Color depth only really mattered when it jumped from 8 to 16 bits, because you went from having 255 colors available to you, which was kind of limiting, to 65,000 something, which is... Nobody ever uses that many colors all at once. I don't know if there are that many shades of colors,
discover some new ones.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you. I'm smarter every day because of you. Where we left them off, they were trying to leapfrog. The Sega CD was kind of a failure, at least in the market place. In its rivals, it just kind of got drowned in just a bunch of other CD
Apparently
garbage.
that thing like got price dropped pretty quick.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was $300 when it came out.
I know.
That's very intense for not a lot of stuff.
On last episode I had, was the Sega CD its own thing, or did you have to attach it to a Genesis?
It was a Genesis attachment. Like it.
So it was $300 plus the cost of a Genesis, or did it come? Was the $300 including the Genesis?
I'm actually not sure. I'm sure some deals were separate, some were together. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I just assumed it was its own separate attachment. If you had a Genesis, now you could play CD games if you bought this.
For $300.
For extra $300.
I know it was an add-on, but I do think that they made later versions of the Genesis that had it.
Yeah.
All right. So at this point in time, Sega decided to put 4 32-bit projects into development. They codename each of these 4 projects Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and Neptune.
We all know which one won.
Yes.
Did they?
And that's why the Sega...
So, jumping forward a little bit in the story, do you think they stopped making consoles because they ran out of planets? Because they covered Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and Neptune for the Saturn, and then when they got to the Dreamcast, they're like Project Pluto, and then they went to make another one, and they're like, "Fuck!"
They found out Pluto wasn't a planet anymore, and that's why the Dreamcast.
Now that's the true reason. All right, so the Saturn project was headed by Hideki Sato, who's going to be a character who comes in a lot. He was one of the best engineers at the time and eventually becomes one of the head engineers at Sega. He was the lead on the SG-1000, the Master System, and the Mega Drive. So him and his team pretty much led the console development.
They knew what they were doing.
So the Saturn was supposed to be a 32-bit console with a CD and a cartridge port, and it was backed up by Project Jupiter, which was going to be a cartridge-only 32-bit system.
Right, yeah. They were very big on, like, we don't want to leave people behind. Like, we want to be backwards. We want to appeal to
They wanted to have
the
something for
cheaper market
everybody.
and the more
Prior to this,
expensive.
Sato and some Sega engineers traveled to meet with Joe Miller, who is an engineer at Sega of America. He's like the Sato kind of over there. They wanted to collaborate on a new Genesis model. They wanted to use double the colors and make it at a lower cost.
Yeah.
That's where the 32-bit color thing got
Fun fact, double the colors is not 32-bit, as we learned. It goes from 255 to 65,000.
Yeah.
Double the colors is 17-bit color.
Joe Miller didn't like this idea.
No, he really didn't. If you actually like go back, he was very open.
Yeah, and like very
Because
open
I
about it.
I watched a thing recently about the 32X.
He wanted to do a full 32-bit expansion for the Genesis because the Genesis was fucking huge in America.
Yeah.
So he wanted to do that. And that's when Project Mars is born. Project Mars was going to be a 32-bit expansion device, just like the CD, for the Genesis, because extending the life of a dying console is better than developing a new one, which is very American. The game was so big, you're like, why build a new one?
Yeah, this is already in the homes of people.
Yeah, exactly. And they backed up the Mars project with Neptune. Their goal was to this is fucking stupid. Their goal was to combine whatever 32-bit expansion they made for the Genesis and the Genesis together to make it built in. a lazy version of developing what they were doing in Saturn.
There's gotta be a better way.
Yeah, which it's so stupid. So 2 side stories came out of this time, which I think are interesting and a great example of how Sega continually shoots themselves in the foot. So we'll just take a little off the beaten path here. The first one. Tom Kalinske was apparently not impressed by the plans for the Saturn, and he wanted to find a different graphics chip. I don't know what he knew about the graphics processing power, or at the time if he was getting caught up in the whole let's get more bits kind of battle. He wanted a new graphics chip. So he met with James H. Clark of a company called Silicon Graphics, and they were working with the MIPS or MIPS computer systems to develop a low-cost, real-time 3D graphics system. In Sega fashion, plans fell through. Sega of America was all about it, but Japan wasn't. They claimed there were unresolved hardware issues, and the project was too risky because of that. And then, ironically enough, also they also wanted exclusive rights because don't forget Sega wanted to be Nintendo. And ironically enough, in 1993, Nintendo ends up picking that deal up instead, and they used that chip in what we call the N64.
Wow!
So they missed out on some good graphic opportunities there. The second story I'm going to touch on a bit because we talked about going deep into this kind of thing in the future. An engineer by the name of Ken Kutaragi had a daughter who loved the NES, and he was determined to get his company into the video game industry. His company was a little company called Sony.
What motivation.
Ken Kutaragi.
Yeah.
The president of Sony at the time, Norio Oga, was approved a partnership with Nintendo. And in 1989, both of the companies let it slip that the Super Famicom Hybrid would have CD tech and a cartridge port.
Yeah.
And at Summer CES 1991, Sony officially announced the Nintendo PlayStation.
That's seriously one of the craziest stories in all of video games.
Yeah, what an
really
insane alternate universe that is. Where that's
it's like extremely believable too, yeah.
The very next day.
Yep.
Nintendo announces that they were not allying with Sony, and instead they're going to go on to work with one of Sony's competitors, Philips.
Sony was pissed.
Yeah. Why? Because Nintendo was afraid that Sony was going to get a better end of the console deal, and then it would divert revenue away from this
I love how they inadvertently and actually created their biggest competitor.
So their alliance with Philip was for licensing deals on Nintendo properties.
We all know what came out of that.
And the Philips CDI. So
Gosh, it sure is boring around here.
You know what they say.
So good deal. Sony was fucking pissed. Hideki's thinking they announced the shit. We're gonna make this cool console. We're so excited.
Nintendo stuck with Philips for a while too. I think they later on still
because they were afraid that Sony would make too much money on the deal. Okay, so Hideki Sato was friends with Sony president Norio Oga. Okay. So Sega of America was already working with Sony Electronic Publishing for games for the Mega CD because they picked up all those third-party publishers in America trying to push the Mega CD failure. So Tom Kalinske, Olafsson. Yeah,
Was he the president of Sweden?
Yeah, Sony.
He came up before.
He's the president of Sony Electronic Publishing.
I just imagine an American guy in a suit, a Japanese guy in a suit, and then a dude in a Viking costume.
And then the Sony of America CEO, Mickey Scholhoff. All three decide to team up for a new console. Plans are made. Sony heads in Japan are like, fuck yeah, approve the deal. Let's get this going. Nintendo just fucked us. Let's get something going. But Sega Japan says no. Just like Nintendo, Hayao Nakayama, the president of Sega, was afraid that Sony would end up getting a better deal and become a bigger partner in the industry that Sega was. And Sega had more history. So after getting burned by both Sega and Nintendo, Sony was like, all right, fuck you guys. We have this little project we're working on. I guess we'll go ahead with it. It's called the PSX. And that eventually becomes the PlayStation, which absolutely fucking destroys Nintendo and the Sega in the coming years. They missed out on an opportunity to work with the upcoming, competition, and they bubbled it and buried themselves.
That was the best example probably in history of living well is the best revenge. You know, that old adage. Because Sony was just like, come on, Nintendo, we really want to get into video games. And they're like, nah, we're afraid you'll take too much money away from us. And they're like, come on, Sega. Nintendo said no. And they're like, no, you're going to take too much money away from us. And they're like, fuck it, I'll do it. And then they did it. And then they took so much money away from Sega that Sega no longer makes hardware.
So the first view of the Saturn came at Winter CES 1994. It wasn't even Sega's main focus of the show. They just showed some photo that was obscured in darkness.
Yeah.
They showed some tech demos for Virtua Soccer, Clockwork Knight, and Panzer Dragoon. A month later...
Because we'll know when they really show the Saturn what happened.
A month later in February, they scrapped Project Jupiter, the 32-bit cartridge system. Cartridges were getting too expensive to produce, and this led to the Saturn also dropping the cartridge in favor of just the CD-ROM system.
You know who should have done that? Nintendo at the N64, because...
However, still around and moving along,
cost money.
the Sega of America Project Mars. At a spring show in 1994, Sega head Nakayama revealed the Saturn to the world. And even the silver-painted system on display was just a block of wood at the time. They showed a tech demo of it running Virtua Fighter, and Virtua Fighter was huge
crazy
in Japan. It's one of the best arcade games of all time there. So people were excited. They saw this tech demo. It looked incredible. It was running well.
Yeah, it made a lot of money over there. And it got relatively big here. There was a following.
Well, and you know what happens when Sega gets some steam, and they got a little bit of backing behind them? In June 1994, at a Sega Gamers Day event, Sega of America, seemingly completely oblivious to the upcoming release of the Sega Saturn, announces the release of its Project Mars, which is now known as the Sega 32X. There will be 32-bit gaming by the end of the year.
The old mushroom top.
Yeah. There will be 32-bit gaming by the end of the year, just not on the system that everyone thought.
Yeah.
And though Sega did put the Saturn on hold in North America because they wanted to wait for software support to catch up, like that's usually what they did, was test in the home market, wait for software support to catch up, and then do all that. I don't think that they meant to put out your own console in the meantime to America. This was stupendously dumb in retrospect.
Oh, it's even dumber is how they launched it here.
All the best developers were already knew about the Saturn. Nintendo had this Ultra 64 project that nobody knew about.
Right, yeah, Ultra 64.
And the Sony PSX project was supposedly supposed to release around 1995. So all the developers knew about these. So the 32X would never compete, they thought. Nobody was enthusiastic about developing for it.
Did you guys know anyone that had that? Did either of you guys have it growing up?
The 32X?
Yeah.
I knew somebody that had it. I didn't have it.
Okay.
I played Doom on it.
Yeah. There was a version of Doom on the 32X, yeah.
Did yours have missing levels and things like that?
I don't know. My friend had it. I played it for 5 seconds.
All right, well, this is an interesting story I found. Sega flew a bunch of journalists from all over the country to San Francisco to stay at this hotel. And then they rented a bunch of buses and took them all to this huge party they were throwing at some San Francisco nightclub. Because you know what a gaming journalists love.
Fucking it. And this is all for the...
Yeah, they were going to promo the 32X.
I love it. This is all like a celebration of the stupid...
Tom Kalinske gave a speech. And then apparently a local rapper performed a song that was too... I looked all over the place.
Oh, no, that was going to be my question. I was like, please tell me you found this song
No,
somewhere.
I fucking wish. He put out a long performance about how great the 32X was. I really wish I fucking had this. Apparently the music was so loud, and all the 32X games they had all over the place sucked so bad. Nobody wanted to play them, and most people just hung out in the lobby to get away from the fucking nightclub party. When some of them tried to leave, they found out that the buses that had dropped them off weren't supposed to come back until after the party was over.
Oh, no.
So they were all stranded there.
Holy shit. This is depressing.
So, the 32X releases on November 21st, 1994 in North America, one day before the Saturn released in Japan.
That's right, yeah.
Oh, God.
Yep.
In the beginning, like most new consoles, it wasn't the absolute worst.
No, well, there was still quite a few people that...
A lot of the sales came around
We're
Thanksgiving.
still playing their Genesis.
Thanksgiving weekend and Christmas sales and all that shit. Holiday season, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They reportedly outsold the 3DO. Whoa! That bar,
You're
buddy.
killing it.
3DO, by the way, company I think founded by Trip Hawkins,
Yeah.
who was brought up
really?
in the last episode.
Didn't the 3DO also cost $800 or something?
Something like that.
Yeah. I know the CDI did.
Arcade ports like Virtua Racing Deluxe and Star Wars Arcade
Fucking A,
did
Star Wars
well.
Arcade.
Yeah, but behind them were a bunch of aging arcade rips. and barely any third-party support because most devs completely skipped the 32X in favor of the Saturn that was coming out.
Which
it was supposed to be stronger.
He also mentioned Doom. Wasn't there a version of Doom also on the Saturn? I think they made a 32X one.
And most of the fans skipped it too.
Yeah.
Since everything was rushed through development to hit the market, games had sound issues.
Yeah.
The Doom port was missing an
about.
entire chunk of the game. That's why I said it. Like, I don't know if it was in all of them, but a lot of people were pissed.
Also, there's like John Carmack. He'll port Doom to anything.
It's true.
You're like, here's a new piece of hardware, and he's such a nerd. He's like, ooh, what?
Yeah.
Hold on, I got nothing to do this weekend.
Yeah, I'm gonna figure this out.
Yeah.
Put Doom on it.
Yeah.
There was a slew of bad launch titles, like a game called Cosmic Carnage. And it looked
I'm
like
not
a
even sure
failed
that one.
Genesis fighter. Like, I looked
There
it
were a
up.
lot of
It
those
is
at the time.
so bad. It's dumb. It's like aliens instead of like fighters, and like it's just the
like
sound is
tattooed
horrible.
assassins.
Like the sound is horrible. The graphics are just
It's hilarious
outdated.
because
That's so
we
funny.
going back to our Giant Bomb episode. Giant Bomb has a great series called Ranking of Fighters.
Yeah.
You don't realize like
just how many
you
there
remember
were.
Virtua Fighter, you remember Soul Calibur, you remember
Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, yeah.
Street Fighter, Smash Brothers. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of really great fighting series out there, but there are from this era there are so many bad fighting games.
Yeah.
Like
fighting games and racing games, man. That was
Yeah.
everything. By the January, which is the start of the next year, there reported that consoles were getting returned. I guess nobody was interested in the 32-bit Echo the Dolphin port for the 32X.
It was hard.
By the way, that Project Neptune from earlier, where they were going to combine the 32X and
Oh,
Genesis
yeah.
into one,
Well, that was
the
some-
dumber way of
the-
making
the stupid
system.
one, yeah.
By the time they had a prototype, the Saturn had a release date in North America. So they scrapped it.
Yeah.
In Japan, the 32X was released in December of 1994. That's after the Saturn came out. So, what was the incentive to buy and program over there? It's even worse than in America. And why? The Saturn's already out. Why would
The
we?
Saturn was out in America?
No, the Saturn was out in Japan.
Oh, yeah, it was out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took like a year to come.
Yeah, by the time the 32X got there,
Yeah.
the Saturn was already out. So they just skipped it completely.
Yeah.
So between this and the Sega CD, Sega took a huge hit to their reputation. The 32X is considered one of the worst console releases of all
Also,
time.
you mentioned that Saturn I think it had a release window. I don't know if it had a specific date because apparently for the Saturn here after it got like pushed back.
Oh, yeah. It didn't
Yeah.
have a specific date
Yeah,
yet.
but they're just like, it's gonna come out probably around this time because that's what made the very first E3 so weird.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. They just canceled the project because there was like, here's when it's coming out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Of course, they knew internally what they were gonna do.
But it wasn't all bad news.
I wonder how many copies the 32X sold.
I did
look
have
it
the
up.
numbers, but yeah, look
I'll
it
look it
up.
up.
It wasn't all
that
bad
thing
news.
was pricey too.
There was still the Saturn. Okay.
Yeah. That little joystick thing.
In Japan, where the Saturn was designed and whose fans it was
Joystick
tailored for,
button.
there was quite a huge success over there.
Yeah.
On November 22nd,
surprising.
1994, the Saturn was released in Japan. In the past, Sega had a bit of trouble supplying the retailers with the product. Like most gaming consoles had those issues back
They're
then.
all playing Nights into Dreams.
Yeah.
Sales estimates for the 32X stood at 665,000 units at the end of 1994.
I mean, that's bad considering Genesis numbers.
And then
Oh,
like Chris
Genesis
said,
was
they were
in the millions.
They were returned at the beginning of 1995, and then it says later the retail price was dropped to $99 and later $20.
Yeah, they were clearing it out for
Yeah.
the Saturn's
Of
coming.
course.
The Saturn was released in Japan, and they had some trouble supplying retailers with product in the past, like most consoles were, but this time they were prepared. They held back 300,000 units
Yes, yep.
for a week until December 3rd because Sony was launching the PlayStation.
There's like weird stories about like retailers being like, "This is a released product," and they just
Yeah.
have it like sitting.
Because
It's really
Sony
weird.
reportedly only sent 100,000 consoles to retailers at launch. So
Damn,
they
that is
would-
not enough.
They wanted to have a bunch of Saturns in the back, so when people couldn't buy PlayStations,
They would buy
Boom,
Saturns.
buy a Saturn. You know,
Yeah.
that is kind of smart, I guess.
The Saturn sold 170,000 units on its first day. It's the most successful console launch in the company's history.
Jeez.
I found a little snippet here in one of these old 90s gaming magazines, which is incredible, by the way. The advertisements are just off the chain. They're like, the ozone's dying. Why don't you go play some games at Blockbuster? I swear to God, it's a real fucking ad I found.
Oh God.
The lines on launch day were hours and hours long for the Saturn.
Oh, Sega's advertising, by the way, they had like they were using like sex appeal in their ads
Oh, yeah.
and all this shit. It was so funny.
So apparently extra staff was hired and dressed like cone heads to keep order.
Wait, like
Not like the SNL bit
Okay.
Coneheads.
Sorry.
Saturn did an ad campaign where the Saturn Coneheads were like aliens
Yep,
from
I
Saturn.
remember this
What?
one.
They look like they're wearing like the Shakespearean like neck thing.
Oh my God.
And they have weird cone heads. They kind of look like the SNL cone heads, to be honest.
That's stupid.
They hired those people to keep order, like go this way, like not like riot gear keep order.
No.
Retrospectively, Sony eventually had the upper hand, but at this time, that wasn't the case. PlayStation was cheaper than the Saturn,
Yeah.
but the Saturn was bundled with 5 games. And
That's kind of crazy to
Yeah.
think about.
all the PlayStation hardware was
games
sold
now.
separately, so overall, it was a higher cost.
Yeah.
One of those bundled games for the Saturn was Virtua Fighter.
Everybody wanted
and
that.
as I said earlier, it's one of the most successful arcade games of all time in Japan. Tons of those sales are people buying solely just to play Virtua
Yeah.
Fighter.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that we don't really think about in an age
Yeah,
of
I saw this bit and this
old-time
made me
wiry controllers. The
Yeah.
Saturn's lead was 7 feet long, and apparently the PlayStation's was really short, and that
Yeah.
took a lot of people got angry about that and would buy the Saturns instead.
We still saw it when Nintendo made the mini consoles or whatever, like the NES Mini and the SNES Mini, and the cable's like 3 feet.
Yeah,
and they're
people
like,
were pissed.
yeah,
This is
you're
brought
like-
up all over the place.
Yeah.
People are like, fuck their leads. I hate this.
Yeah.
And on top of this, Sega still had that clout, man. 10 years of successful cutting-edge arcade games, and Sony just made the Walkman and the Discman. So they had, like, a lot to prove. Like, this isn't the Sony in gaming that we know nowadays. This is the electronics company who just decided to release their own console.
The Walkman guys?
Yes,
All right.
all right.
The late release of the 32X didn't have the same kind of horrible impact in Japan because the Saturn was already out. It was forgotten, buried, and killed within a year. They just, like, nobody cared about it. It was brushed right over.
yeah.
And by the end of the 1994 holiday season, the Saturn had sold 500,000 to Sony's 300,000. The middle of the following year, Saturn hit 1 million consoles. Then they price dropped. So Sony did manage to catch up a little bit during this time, but the holiday season 95, Sega beat out PlayStation again with help from Virtua Fighter 2, Sega
Ooh.
Rally Championship, and Virtua Cop.
Virtua Cop.
So a
That's
fighter,
the-
a racer,
yeah.
and Virtua Cop.
And a rail shooter, I guess, right?
Yeah. There was another price drop in mid 96.
Right, yeah, wait, Virtua Cop, isn't that the blue?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fucking Lieberman's favorite.
And there's a price drop in mid 96. Sega was outselling the PlayStation 2-1, just like they did with the Genesis in America to Nintendo. Their market share went from 12% to 32% from 94 to 95.
Jeez.
Nintendo went from 75% to 33% in that same time period.
Yeah.
Nintendo hadn't put out anything. And then Nintendo releases the N64 in September 2 in Japan. Pretty lukewarm reception. Like, most people were kind of disappointed.
Well,
in
because it only launched with 2 games.
Yeah.
And even though one of them was
One of the best games of
games
all
of
time.
all time, like literally an invention of an entire dimension and genre.
Yeah.
But like people were very, it's weird. Like the way that they looked at that stuff was like nowadays you wouldn't release a console with 2 games.
No.
Like it's not. Yeah.
So Sega continued their lead over both Sony and Nintendo until the beginning of 1997, when Sony dealt a major blow with a game by Kabushiki Gaisha Sukue, or as it's known here,
Yeah.
Square. They released.
They simplified that a little bit.
Yeah, they released the game Final Fantasy VII, and that game.
A game originally in development for the Nintendo 64, and then they
Yeah.
went with cartridges and weren't able to.
You couldn't fit.
Yeah.
You couldn't fit the game.
But
I
previously
mean,
a
they
series
didn't fit on
dominated
a CD
time.
either,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
easier
It
to
was
make 3
multiple.
CDs
Yeah.
than multiple cartridges.
Yeah.
So this game rocketed PlayStation sales. It literally shot them ahead.
In Japan, absolutely.
Yeah, it gave them the lead. Now, across the sea, Sega of America, they weren't looking so good. The press were excited about the Saturn, but they were like, what's with all those resources you put into the 32X?
Yeah.
Like, what's going to happen with this? They thought that all that they put into it was a sign that they didn't trust Saturn. And after all, Sega had 55% market share. The Genesis had outsold
crazy,
Nintendo
yeah.
in the holiday season for 3 straight years and was still in 1995 looking to
But
do it
think
again.
about if you did that now. Think about if you announced 2 products and you're just like, there's this weaker one that we're like kind of half invested in, but then like look at this other one that's on the horizon. Why would anybody buy the first one?
exactly.
Like it's really bad business.
Tom Kalinske, in regards to his trust of the Saturn, quote, I was in Japan for the launch of the Saturn, and it was selling out as fast as it was arriving in stores. I'm amazed at how they managed to sell so many of these machines at what are very high prices. But the U.S. is a very different market to Japan, and we in Sega USA recognize the importance of proper pricing.
There were kids skipping down the street and to their gumdrop houses wearing their Sega t-shirts.
So pricing, this is all how it is.
Yeah, yep.
He was convinced that 32X would still outsell the competition just because the importance of price in the U.S. market.
Yeah.
A release date was eventually chosen for the Saturn Day. Fucking garbage.
Oh my god.
September 2nd, 1995.
I read through that and I thought it was a typo.
Nope.
Fun fact.
Are they trying to capitalize on like the Mortal Kombat Monday or Mortal Monday or whatever?
If you type Saturn Day into Google, it says, "Did you mean Saturday?" So there you go.
Nobody would actually.
It was
write
pushed
that.
back
That's
this far
stupid.
because Kalinsky wanted at least 10 games to be ready at launch.
Yeah.
It was reported that there would be 20 games at launch and 100 more by
100
Christmas.
more, yeah.
Japan told Sony of America to have the Saturn on shelves by fall 1995. However, they caught some wind on the PlayStation. Maybe about its specs, maybe about how well it was going to sell here.
Yeah.
The Final Fantasy was about to come out,
yeah.
all this stuff. More Final
They
Fantasy
saw
was
that
in
T-Rex
development.
demo running
Yeah.
on that thing.
So, Tom Kalinske had other plans in mind. At E3 1995.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to jump the gun
No,
into
it's
this
okay.
earlier, but it's one of my favorite. Like,
This is the first E3 ever.
because fucking imagine if this happened today. Like everybody in the audience would just be like, "Wait, what?" And then like look at their phones, and, like nobody would know what to do.
Tom Kalinske, thinking that it would drum up some PR and excitement, announced that the Saturn, with 6 titles, would be available across the United States immediately.
That's so like, and they kept that a secret. Like
If the PlayStation 5, they were just like, it's available today.
Yeah,
like, there would
like-
be riots.
yeah, people would be shoving people out of the way to
Yeah.
leave. Like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
This caught the crowd off guard. I was like, wait,
Yeah,
what?
yeah.
But you know who else they caught off guard? Retailers. Because they had no fucking idea that either. Tom Clancy was just like, it's coming out today. And they're like, wait, there's nothing in our back room.
What's
What?
hilarious is that a lot of representatives of retailers are at E3, so imagine it's like your job to manage all the like Funko lands in a region, and then you're sitting there like, it's gonna be, it's in stores now, and you're like, wait, no, what?
Sega didn't have enough consoles or software to justify that kind of fucking launch.
Yeah.
They could only supply Toys R Us, Electronic Boutique, and a few select
man.
others, okay? KB Toys
Up
got
yours,
snubbed.
KB. Yeah.
And they ultimately refused to sell the system at all because they got snubbed.
Yeah, all right. They had the grudge about it.
Yeah. On top of that, the $399 price tag meant no retailer made a profit.
What
on
is
the
that in
systems.
today's money too? Like that's
They relied completely on software to make up the to make
I'm
up the
curious.
rest of the money.
I'm gonna look this up.
We look at exchange rates. It's
Yeah.
probably like the same.
What?
Can we talk about capitalism and inflation?
I looked it up, and that would be $665.53.
Holy shit. Later that same E3, Sony Entertainment of America chief Steve Race got on stage.
His
and
last name's Race.
Yeah, and
great.
announced that the PlayStation would be released at $299.
Oh, right, that was their whole fucking.
And then walked off stage immediately to a roaring applause.
Apparently, they had this whole script, and then he just did that and left.
Yeah,
That's
because they were
fucking-
like, Saturn down, it costs $400. He was like, the PlayStation costs $300. See ya. And they just left.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah. That's funny.
As Sega got more stock, they staggered their release across the cities and retailers.
Yeah.
Not to mention the software was limited to just those 6 titles because all the devs were like, no, we're still working on games for September.
Hey, one of those was Daytona USA.
Sony just sat back and watched the market, fine-tuning their own launch, and eventually on September 9th, the PlayStation was released, and Sega was not ready for this. The PlayStation launch broke records. 80,000 Saturns were sold leading up to the PlayStation release, and 100,000 PlayStations were pre-ordered.
It's not even out yet.
Another 130,000 were sold within the first week. Sony was selling so much software, they ran out of plastic cases. So Sega's consolation prize, they sold Sony some of their cases for the Saturn games. This is why the game Rayman was originally released with a long Saturn Saturn case, apparently.
Oh my god.
So, yeah.
Those old PlayStation cases.
They're like,
the
we're selling
long
too many. Can we
cardboard
have
ones."
some of yours? You're not selling them? Sure.
Yeah. So that's the most defeating thing.
Tom Kalinske, who was tired of the Japanese hand of Sega being too heavy on Sega of America, resigned. Not because
that's a problem still with a lot of game companies these days.
Followed by David Rosen, and then Sega Japan head Hayao Nakayama.
I think David
They're all out
Rosen
the
was a character also in our ESRB.
Yeah. So, a few price drops and a couple free game bundles. They paired games for free with it. Managed to keep the sales going for a little while. But in the beginning of 1997, Saturn sales weren't all that bad. But compared to the newly released Nintendo 64, selling almost 400,000 consoles a month on average, the PlayStation was selling almost 200,000 consoles a month on average, and the Saturn just set at around 77,000.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. The N64 at this point, you had Mario 64 and Star Fox and GoldenEye and Ocarina of Time's over the horizon.
Yeah, that 400,000 number did drop down soon after that, but around that time it was high. By August 97, the market share, Sony 47, Nintendo 40, Sega 12%.
55 to 12.
55 to 12 in under 3 years, 2 years.
Man.
Ultimately, the competition was better at marketing.
Yeah.
And it was easier to program for. Apparently, the Saturn was really hard to program for. The N64 and the PlayStation outsold the Saturn and surpassed it technically. Not to mention continual fumbles and underestimations by Sega themselves.
Yeah.
But it's like
and the 3D games on the CD were like not even really 3D. Like, you know what I mean?
No.
Like, because
a lot of people thought the Saturn was supposed to be a 2D system.
Yeah.
Because it didn't.
I should have
3D
asked
that well.
first. I was curious. Did either of you guys ever have a CD or play?
No.
No. I don't know many people that did.
The Saturn?
The Saturn, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
I never had a Saturn because I got the N64 and then I got the PlayStation later. And then by
Yeah.
the time I would have had enough money to spend any money on a Saturn, I don't think they were available. And also, I ended up buying a GameCube and then Xbox and then PlayStation 2.
You made the right decision.
I did go back and buy a Dreamcast after Sega shut down everything.
That stuff got cheap.
I bought it for $30 at GameStop.
Crap.
Yeah.
It's just weird because the Sega Saturn's a weird console to me because I was playing games aggressively at this time and I somehow just missed that. Like I went right from the Genesis and Super Nintendo to the PlayStation and N64.
To go back to our Halo episode, I used to go over this one kid's house for Halo LAN parties, like once a month, and he had a Sega Saturn. And one night, we got done playing Halo, and a bunch of people were like falling asleep.
So you're like, let's go play some Sonic Adventure
And
2.
he also had a Dreamcast. So that was the first time I ever played Soul Calibur.
Oh, okay.
But we also beat all of Panzer Dragoon over the
Panzer
course of a
Dragoon's
couple
fun.
months, and we also played a lot of Virtua Fighter. So yeah.
Okay.
Its legacy lives on, though. It's one of the most popular consoles of all time in Japan, which is crazy, considering how bad it failed here.
Yeah. I mean, now Japan doesn't even buy consoles much. They're much more mobile. And
Apparently its controller set the future standard for analogs, which I didn't know because it had that one little analog. I guess was that big disc controller.
Yeah, well,
Like
that
a
was
nub.
I mentioned that earlier. The little nub. It's kind of like the PSP one. Like it's not because like people are like, hey, the N64 was the first controller
apparently
with a
that
joystick.
tech was
but,
like the edge there. It
Going
was
back
like,
to
holy shit.
it's hard to feel. There was actually a official controller released for the NES that had that in it, and it felt like crap. And what 8-bit games were using it, but they did do it, you know.
So during this time, a supposed 64-bit add-on for the Saturn was discussed.
Why? Why try? Well, let's try it again.
They were afraid about the 32X debacle, and they put that to rest.
Yeah,
There's also Project Pluto, which Sega had failed to market the Netlink modem attachment. But they did entertain the idea of melding the modem and the Saturn together. But this was also scrapped. But those two concepts foretell Sega wasn't out of the game yet, and the codename Katana was still to come. Even though the Saturn was doing extremely well in Japan, mostly thanks to Virtua Fighter's success, it didn't stop Sega from being themselves and looking forward to the future too soon. Once again, they tried to leapfrog, and there were whispers of a Saturn II. Lockheed Martin, not know they were involved. They had worked on the graphics for the Sega Model 1 and 2 arcade boards, and they were working for a Model 3. So the Sega Saturn II was put in their hands, and they're like, focus on graphical power. Like, make everything look good.
Stop making product. Like, what was their R&D at the time? Like, it was just like...
However, due to a delayed release on the Model 3 by almost a year, Sega lost some of its competitiveness in the arcade market, and they were upset because they kept fucking up consoles. That's where most of their money was coming from.
the arcade market was also at this time probably starting to go down.
Dying, yeah.
Like
Lockheed Martin put up several designs for Saturn II, but all were shut down, and eventually the Model 3 would be the last project for the pair. They cut ties with Lockheed Martin.
And then Lockheed Martin just made more missiles.
Yeah. Saturn II project shut down. Then they went back to their cash cow missiles. So next up for the challenge, rising graphics company NVIDIA. They had based their first card off the Saturn tech.
That's
so much so that it had a built-in port where you could plug a Saturn controller into the card.
Yeah,
that was standard with their first.
That's great.
And a few successfully converted games wouldn't convince the skeptical Sega that this was the tech of the future. It wasn't helped by poor card sales.
Yeah.
NVIDIA still moved forward on the NV2, briefly partnered with Sega and tried to make a Saturn V08 project. But a few failed tech demos and the alluring rival of 3DFX put that project to bed as well. And now NVIDIA is obviously bankrupt and failed. And, they're not good at what they do.
They're out of the business. They hung it up.
All right. The PC gaming market was growing and becoming run by two graphic standards. Weird. Is that changed?
No.
So there was the Power VR by Videologic.
Wow, they were into VR.
And the Voodoo cards by 3DFX.
That's insensitive.
You know anything about these guys, Austin?
I've heard of 3DFX. I don't know what Videologic is.
This time, Sega would start 2 Saturn II projects. One.
Just start one. just stop. Just stop doing it.
One using each of the 2 cards and developing in parallel. Videologic's project would be developed in Japan under codename Dural, which is apparently a character from Virtua Fighter, but
okay.
I don't know. I've never played Virtua Fighter. Or a little bit, but not like enough to remember it.
Yeah.
3DFX would develop in the US under codename Black Belt. They were like, give each of their divisions develop consoles.
Right,
what could go wrong there? The new Sega president, Shoichiro Majiri, that's what it sounds like, but I slaughtered that absolutely. Thank fuck he doesn't come back.
I'm not covering Japanese companies
There are
anymore.
way too many dots above letters in that name, I will say that much.
He would hire former IBM engineer Tatsuo Yamamoto, much easier, like the O's. And he was going to head Project Black Belt. And then Sega's console veteran Hideki Sato, who worked on everything from the SG-1000 to now, would head Project Dural in Japan. The Hitachi SH4 was chosen to be the CPU for both projects.
It's a vibrator, right?
Yeah. I know they went back and forth on what CPUs they would use and eventually landed on that. Black Belt would use the 3DFX Voodoo 2, and Dural would use the Project VR Series 2. They weren't very creative. They just added numbers after their models.
After a while.
Sega shifted their policy away from...
Good thing they got away from that.
Sega shifted their policy away from pure graphics power and focused more instead of making the machine easier to develop for. Because that was a problem that they consistently had. Black Belt seemed to be pulling ahead. It had an OS that was specifically designed for easy development.
Okay.
The 3DFX was seen as the more powerful card. It had the backing of new Sega of America president Bernie Stoller.
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. And for what most thought was dedication and a sign of commitment, Sega purchased 16% equity in 3DFX in 1997. Because
why not? They're rolling in it right now.
Yeah.
They bought part of 3DFX, 16%. They were also seeking software partners during this time. Sega Soft got on board with Black Belt, and then talks began with a little company called Microsoft. All these things pointed to All these things pointed to Black Belt becoming the next console to be developed by Sega. And the deal with 3DFX hardware suggested that even more. So, in Japan, Project Dural goes public under the name Katana. And Sega instead chooses to go with Sato's Power of VR design officially. No one knows the exact reason for the change of heart at the last minute, but there is speculation. Some say it was just more powerful. The Sonic team dev Yuji Naka, when asked if Sonic would be ported to PC, said it was impossible because the 3DFX Voodoo cards being used would not be powerful enough.
It was impossible to port any of these games to PC like way back then. You ever see there was some leaked footage a couple of years ago of Mario Brothers 3 running on a computer, and it was just awful. It was just unplayable.
Yeah. And that's the card Sony of America was using.
Yeah.
Some say it's because NEC, which is the company that owned Videologic is a Japanese company, and the loyalties lie with the Japanese companies. But most likely it's our old friend capitalism. NEC was the world's largest manufacturer of PCs, notebooks, and handheld kind of things of computer relation at that time. And almost every one of their products contained parts made by our old friends Microsoft. By using one of their valued customers, Microsoft was likely to benefit, and because of their new partnership with Sega, Sega was likely to come out on top too. NEC could develop the chips at half the price of 3DFX.
Jeez.
So it's a lot of people speculate that Microsoft pushed behind the scenes to get them to ditch the American console and go with the Japanese one so they could make some money shipping NEC parts.
Also, a weird side note, this is also cited as one of the reasons why that company closed down, I think. 3DFX?
Yeah.
After the Dreamcast came out, they started to get a lot of criticism that their cards weren't powerful enough, and I think they were purchased by NVIDIA in 2001.
So good for them. At least they came out a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So 3DFX, Sega of America, a lot of other people were fucking pissed. The axing of Project Black Belt meant that a ton of jobs were going to be lost at Sega of America. Like, they were just about to lay off a bunch of people. And there were at least 5 walkouts and protests. 3DFX was doing a great job, and it seems out of nowhere. Sega tried to claim the reason was 3DFX leaked tech specs when they went public with their company in 97. But I looked it up, and everything related to the tech was apparently blacked out on the thing. So that was nonsense. They were just looking for a scapegoat. The worst part was that due to its stake in the company, Sega could and would stop the tech from getting into the hands of their rivals, specifically Sony, who showed interest in the chips. So in September, 3DFX filed a $155 million lawsuit against Sega and NEC, claiming that they had been misled into believing their tech will be used on an upcoming project, when in reality, 2 Japanese companies made a backdoor deal months prior. Greg Ballard, the president and CEO of 3DFX Interactive, said, quote, "We lived up to all our commitments, yet they terminated the agreement. It's a clear breach of contract." Not to mention, Sega was working with their rivals and had access to their IP, and they were obviously worried that they would get their tech stolen by their rivals. In August of 1988, Sega settled with 3DFX for $10.5 million. Couldn't find anything about that, just that they settled. They probably brushed it under the door because it's bad press. On top of this, someone else was confused. EA. They also owned equity in 3DFX. Bernie Stolar was a friend of EA head Larry Probst. Probst brought a deal that all sports games will be exclusively sold on the new system for 5 years. That plan that made the Genesis super successful. So, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, lean back into the sports.
Sega couldn't meet the terms of the deal, however, but it didn't even seem like they wanted to. They just purchased a company called Visual Concepts, and it was looking like their title, NFL 2K, was going to be superior to Madden 2000.
I mean, I think that was a better game.
Apparently was.
Yeah,
it was apparently much better.
But
Madden was Madden.
Yeah, and Madden was Madden, exactly.
So these two things, the weird deal pull out for 3DFX and the Visual Concepts buy, led to EA not having any support on Project Katana whatsoever.
Yeah.
A mistake that would eventually be stated as one of the major reasons for its failure. After a 1998 Electronics Gaming Magazine poll suggested that 37% of people liked the name Katana and 37% of people didn't like any of Sega's concept names, the Sega Dreamcast was finally shown to the world.
I think the Dreamcast is a good name.
Yeah, it got like 12% in that poll.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, it was announced at the Sega New Challenge Conference with a November Japanese release date. And it was supposedly to be announced 17 days earlier on May 10th, but it was pushed back because of the announcement of now Squaresoft's Final Fantasy VIII. And after the last time, Sega really didn't want to mess around with Final Fantasy because they tanked their last console.
Yeah.
At E3, Bernie Stolar announced the North American release for autumn 1999. And at the Sonic Adventure Conference a year later, people got to see the Dreamcast run at its final hardware specs, and it looked fucking amazing.
At the time, that was insane. They showed that demo of Sonic Adventure 1, the whale, him, running towards the camera and everything with the killer whale chasing him in the background. That really blew people away.
It looked fucking incredible.
Because nobody saw footage of PS2 games at this point, or GameCube or Xbox games. They just went right from seeing the N64 and the PlayStation 3D to that.
Yeah, exactly. Due to a history of jumping the gun and just doing whatever they wanted, Japan kept a tight leash on Sega of America, forcing them to wait until the console was tested, wait for more software, wait for more hardware,
It worked out well last
all
time.
that stuff. That didn't stop Sega of America, though. In typical fashion, going against his Japanese superiors, they wanted to price the Dreamcast at $249, and Bernie Stoller announced it at $199 to a standing ovation. He was then fired before the release of the Dreamcast.
Oh my god.
So they just keep going like, we do whatever we want on stage.
Yeah, I love the E3s of this era. They're the
I saw a brief snippet that said that
Or
there was
just,
there was an altercation on Sony's show floor between Dreamcast and PlayStation people, but I couldn't find anything about it, so I don't know where it came from.
That's
Like
so good.
there was no sources, there was nothing. I googled all over the fucking place. I looked around in these magazines, like I couldn't find anything.
Yeah. We'll have to find out someone who was there. Brilliant.
So on November 27th, 98, Dreamcast is launched in Japan.
Not nearly as cool sounding of a date.
No. Many believed it was too early because the Saturn was a massive hit. Its launch was stifled by production mishaps.
The opposite problem.
Yeah, exactly. The Saturn was still doing
Yeah.
good, so they were like, why do we
I
need a
wonder
new
what the
console
Dreamcast
already?
launched with in Japan, considering like here there was this huge first
yeah.
wave of heavy
Oh,
hitters.
very.
Yeah.
So there was apparently they were stifled by production mishaps. NEC was only able to produce 30% of the graphics chips they promised. There were some issues with one of the electronic parts I looked up, but it's just great. They went with the competition because it was cheaper, and they paid for it.
Yeah.
The console sold out before it launched, which sounds good, but that meant that they were at the mercy of depending
Right.
on production to
Yeah,
fill the
they're
sales
losing
at this
money
point.
after
The
that
plan
point.
on releasing one game a week apart all year also fell apart too, with half of the planned titles being pushed back last minute. Sonic Adventure was pushed back.
Wow, that wasn't a launch game there?
Resident
Man.
Evil Code Veronica was
on,
pushed
fuck.
back. Blue Stinger was pushed back. A bunch more.
So I have a list. It launched in Japan with Godzilla Generations.
Yes,
a
which
game
never
called-
even made it to America.
Yeah.
No, it probably
a game
wasn't
called
good.
July.
What?
Pen Tricelon and Virtua Fighter 3.
Okay. Which Virtua Fighter? I don't know if Virtua Fighter 3 is as remembered as.
No, 2 and
as-
1 are pretty
yeah.
much, well, and the arcades.
Man, they didn't even have crazy
No,
taxi
they had a
or
game called
Space Channel
Geist
5.
Force that was canceled altogether. At the New Challenge Conference in '99, the price was dropped, causing a 10,000% increase in sales. 65,000 consoles were sold in 4 days. This was good for the Dreamcast. So good, in fact, that officials from Japan's Fair Trade Commission raided 30 Sega offices to find evidence of price fixing.
Wow.
Yeah. Sega was allegedly pressured.
They got investigated.
Yeah, allegedly pressuring retailers into maintaining that price drop because they were selling good because of it. Sega said they would cooperate, but they couldn't comment on the allegations, and that was all I could find.
Right.
Because that shit was buried fast.
Man,
Also, at
that's
that
some
time,
dirty
Coca-Cola
underground-
was getting gone after, like a bunch
they did get
of, a
gone
bunch
after
of
for
people.
price fixing,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're getting caught up in price fixing. So, in North America, the launch date was set for, like you said at the beginning of episode 1, 9999.
What a solid.
But apparently in July you could get the Dreamcast already. Some Hollywood videos you could rent the Dreamcast for a $350 deposit and for
What?
$20 for a 2-day rental of Sonic Adventure.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
I know they got, like, people imported them. Like, I don't know if they were region encoded. I'm not sure. But I know that people, like, those consoles made it over here before then.
I rented a Dreamcast from Hollywood Video.
Was it before it was out?
I don't think so.
That's
they
really
might-
crazy.
Yeah,
though.
this was in July. That's like way
That's,
ahead.
yeah, that's ahead. And this was hugely anticipated.
Oh, yeah.
There was so much money being put into promotions. They were on Good Morning America
Yeah.
again.
Even though it had a weirdly ineffective It's
I
Thinking
remember-
marketing
yeah.
campaign
Yeah.
where the Dreamcast is supposedly like an AI that would grow and outsmart people and it had all these weirdly cryptic ads that never even
some of
said
those
what the
commercials-
Dreamcast was.
It reminds me of those fucking terrible PlayStation 3 ads with like the baby doll crying and then there's like an explosion of black goo and then doves fly out of it. And you're like,
Dude,
what?
it's so cryptic.
Yeah,
it's just like pictures of like stars and like weird technology, and it's just like it's thinking.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we're like,
like, I don't
what
know,
is
what
it?
is
What's thinking? like it was such a dumb fucking move. So apparently, in a New York TV test market, 50% of the people knew that the Dreamcast was coming, but they had
didn't
no
know what
idea
it
what it was. Apparently, like, unless you were like really into gaming at the time,
Yeah,
like
why
you'd be
would you
struggling
know?
to know if Sega was even releasing a console.
What is this? Like some sort of DVD toaster?
Yeah. Even with all that, there were 200,000 pre-orders and 500,000 sold within 2 weeks of launch.
Still pretty fucking good.
Apparently, it was one of the fastest growing console launches.
They also
of all
made
time.
an event out of it. Like that, apparently, they credit the Dreamcast with popularizing the idea of doing midnight releases. Like that was like, hey, like we'll open our doors up at midnight, like wait in line for days, get your number. Like
Nice.
Now that stuff's kind of going away, you know, with things like Amazon and digital. But like at the time, they apparently like they were able to bring people out to stores, like
absolutely.
in celebration.
But what about Saturn Day? You forgot about Saturn Day.
Sega was quick to point out that its almost $98 million opening day take was more than, you guessed it, the Star Wars Phantom Menace's opening weekend.
I mean, that's actually significant. I don't think
It is significant,
Yeah, that
but
is
in
very
retrospect, that's not the best bar.
it's not. But the quality, like, it's not about the quality
That's
of
also
the thing. It's
that's
just
also a
about
bad comparison because when you think about it, you're selling the Dreamcast for $200 a pop, but it must cost them that, if not more, to make a Dreamcast. It's
yeah, they lost money
$98
on every console
We
sold.
sold $90 million worth of Dreamcasts. It's like, yeah, we made a movie once and then sold $90 million worth of tickets, and
Yeah.
we didn't have to produce each ticket for more than it cost to sell it.
Yeah.
I mean, that movie probably still had a pretty big budget.
Yeah.
But
NFL
And it's
2K. It is great.
That's great.
NFL 2K, Soul Calibur, and Sonic Adventure were at the top of the charts.
I
And they
owned all
helped,
three of those games.
they helped the Dreamcast eat
you
into
have Crazy
Nintendo
Taxi?
64's market share, too.
No.
fuck you. You have Ready to
I
Rumble
bought
Boxing?
it for $30 after they went out of business,
yeah.
dude.
They ported that
I couldn't
later
find
anyway.
Crazy Taxi.
Yeah.
5 months into its life, they had a 20% market share, 2.5 million units sold. It's like I said, it's one of the highest like progressing console launches of all time. Like,
totally.
once again, the Sony wave was coming.
Like in the most fucking just like ongoing trail of tears for Sega. Like they come out and they're just like, yeah.
Sega's
what?
like, we made it, the fastest selling console of all time, and Sony's just like, yeah, PlayStation 2 has
Drop
120
the mic
million
again.
copies.
Yeah. Isn't the PlayStation 2 still the best-selling console of all time?
Yeah, I think
So
so.
it's PlayStation 1.
No.
It's PlayStation 2.
I think it's the PlayStation 2. That or the
it's,
DS.
It's either the PlayStation 2 or the DS, but they're both well above like 120,
Hundreds, yeah,
110 million.
The
something like that.
PlayStation 2 was successful in Japan, and it was arriving in time for the holiday season in 2000 in North America, and it was going to be a hit. By the end of 2000, the Dreamcast slowed way down.
Might even be like 140 million.
It sold
for all I
even
know.
less than the N64 and the original PlayStation. It doesn't even mention the
Jeez.
PlayStation 2 numbers, which some were
Yeah.
saying was like 6-1.
Actually, sorry, not to reckon, but it might. I know the Game Boy was up there. The original Game Boy might be like one of the top
Yeah.
selling consoles of all time.
However, the
But yeah.
PS2 was having production issues, and Sega, hoping that people would instead flock to the cheaper console, made sure that Sony knew about their shortcomings. They took out a full-page spread in Game Week, printed postcards, sent them all over to Sony, and
come
apparently
on.
had a truck drive around in front of EA's
What?
headquarters in Redwood City, all with the picture of this kid on it, sticking out his tongue with his thumbs and his ears. And next to the picture it said, "Our deepest condolences to Sony on their PS2 shipping difficulties." And here, if you guys want to see what
This
it
picture?
looked like.
Oh, look at that.
Oh my god.
God. Amazing. That's
It's petty. I love it so much. On January 2001.
so literally like their attack ad wasn't that their thing was bad or that people didn't like it. It was you're out of it. Like
Yeah.
we've got some of the something else. Like what? Like that's not even a really good.
No.
That's like
We're sorry, you can't make consoles fast enough to sell them.
yeah, because
We
people
can,
love
and we're
it so
not
much.
selling them.
Yeah, like
By January 2001, only 3 million Dreamcasts have been sold. So 2.5, and then only 500,000 more.
yeah. Also,
Through the holiday season.
Not to get into it, but I think around early 2001, around this time was like when the word started to get out about their place in hardware. Not like officially at any point, but it was like they had all these games on the docket.
Yeah.
And then things were getting canceled and coverage wasn't the same. Like it was apparently it was like a huge deal that they had that partnership with Sierra to port Half-Life to the Dreamcast. Dreamcast, and like that got canceled, and everyone's like whose job it is to review or cover games or retailers to see what's coming out, to inform people like to pre-order or whatever. Everybody's like, hey, like the logbooks is like slowing down like what's going on with our like consistent release of Dreamcast games. Like, yeah,
It was initially successful. It was once again unable to beat
happened
its
fast.
competition. They announced the production cancellation. So
Yeah.
they were done making
there
it.
it is. Wow, that was that early, huh? Okay.
The consistent financial losses over the years at Sega had finally taken their toll. Sega was unable to compete with Sony or Nintendo, and eventually Microsoft in their marketing realms. And though they had good Hallmark titles, the competition was better, or at least better at selling more systems for those Hallmark titles to be played on.
Yeah.
The Dreamcast was Sega's last ride into the world of console gaming, and though ultimately Sega lost the competition, they didn't go out quietly into the night. Some of its innovations and releases changed the face of gaming forever.
Can I have, I just want to add one little tidbit here that I just found interesting. I was looking this up earlier. The very last game that they published for their console was Sonic Shuffle, which was the Mario Party Sonic
Talk
knockoff.
about going out with a bang instead of a whimper.
And that was on March 9th. But there was also a game, I know I've talked to you guys about, I think I referenced it earlier because I'm an idiot. Chris, have you ever heard of a game called Sega Gaga?
No.
Did we talk about this before? So Sega Gaga was, because Sonic Shuffle was the last game published by Sega for the Dreamcast here and in the UK. But they had one last hurrah. Sega made a game exclusively in Japan that came out on March 29th, 2001, after they already announced that they were exiting the space. It was an RPG about the story of the Dreamcast and how they were being defeated by a rival game company. And it was a crossover game that featured all these characters from all the other games like Sonic and, you know, and so it's so weird. Apparently, according to the wiki, it takes place in Tokyo in 2025, and it's about Sega only has 3% share of the console market. And then they're basically their Sony enemy, which is releasing the PlayStation 2. And there's all these your party has Alex Kidd in it and Sonic, and it's this. Apparently, the whole game is this last ditch effort to save the company from extinction and to make the Dreamcast be back on top again and to defeat Sony. And I just think that's a hilarious, because at that point they didn't really care. Apparently the game had tons of stolen cameos from movies and stuff like that because they didn't care. They were already leaving the Karate Kid is in it, I think.
Yep.
And this was an official game that they put out, and it only came out in Japan. But I just thought that was such a funny and cheeky way to end the reign. And then, once they said that they were kind of done with hardware, but they were going to get into they were still going to stay alive one way or another through the software game. Their first published game not on their platform was a collaboration with Nintendo to publish Super Monkey Ball for the GameCube exclusively, and this came out in Japan on September 14th, 2001, which may have been a launch title. But I just think it's crazy that in 1 year they go from being this over a decade-long competition to then publishing a game exclusively on your enemy's console. And it's, hey, Super Monkey Ball, great game. Those guys went on to make F-Zero GX, which Sega published, I think. So it was weird that it was a lot of the games we were talking about earlier, or that you mentioned, Sonic Adventure and Code Veronica, would find life on the GameCube and the PS2 and stuff like that. So it was they actually left with dignity. They actually kind of those games still went on to find homes and for people to play them, but it's just so crazy and how quick that happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They published Halo Wars too.
Right?
Yeah, it's so weird.
I couldn't figure out a way to work this into the development story narrative, but obviously there were Netlink modems that were built into the Genesis and the Saturn.
Yeah.
Or not built in, but sold with as attachments. But the Dreamcast is widely agreed upon as the first home console to ever come with a built-in modem.
Yeah.
Which is where I mentioned the Dreamcast was the inspiration for the Xbox, including an Ethernet port.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could browse the web on that thing and check email.
That was actually the
you could download demos.
That was the goal. They wanted it to be computery. Check your email.
Windows.
Look at this shit.
Yeah, it did. There was that little Windows.
If you go back and listen to our Xbox episode, we talk about how they had two projects in development. One of them ran its own DirectX operating system, and one of them ran the modified Windows CE or whatever.
CE, which is what was on the Saturn.
That's what ran on the Dreamcast.
Oh, sorry, Dreamcast. Yeah.
So like Dreamcast was pretty inspirational to Microsoft that they're like, we can run a game console that runs Windows.
And they worked with them for a while.
I know it's like a
scenes,
cliche to say that the Dreamcast was ahead of its time, but it really was.
Yeah.
Like,
it was, absolutely.
There's a reason why that's become so.
They changed gaming culture forever. They saw the standard of online gaming coming.
Yeah.
They restructured their company for it, and they also committed by striking deals with AT&T for infrastructure. Like,
it was more forward thinking than the PS2 for online. They sold that shit way later. You know,
they were
with
all
the
about it, man.
hard drive.
So obviously, online gaming is now
they were just too
important
ahead of the times. That's the problem. They did it when it didn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
I also want to give honorable mentions to a couple games.
Typing of the Dead.
Out. Crazy Taxi, incredible.
Yeah.
Jet Set Radio, one of my favorite fucking games
Jet Set
of all
Radio is
time.
awesome.
Shenmue, which might be worthy of its own episode by itself because of the
Yes.
stupid shit that happened in that development.
The guy that made Shenmue is a fascinating character because he is very prolific.
He's the proto. He's the
Kojima before Kojima. Like,
proto Kojima.
Yeah, totally.
I remember we talked about it, and I found arguments online with people arguing over who's the most prolific video game developer of all time, and he was like in the top 3 with like Shigeru Miyamoto and like
We'll have to definitely do a story on Shenmue if we can find enough about it.
But you mentioned, like, I see stuff in here about the VMU, which was like,
I love that thing.
That was the first idea that I can think of a dual screen sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Basically, it was a memory card that you plugged into the top of the controller, if you don't remember, and it would show shit in the game, like your health and bullets, and like it had radar and stuff like that. You could pull
and
it
you
out,
could play
and
little
it was
games on it. It
was a Tamagotchi.
It had a little D-pad and like some buttons on it. It was like a Game
They were like,
Boy,
the Tamagotchi craze is huge. Let's make a Tamagotchi memory card that we plug into the top of the controller. That sounds like some 80s shit right there. You know what I mean?
I mean, you mentioned the online stuff and everything. Like the Quake 3 on the Dreamcast had fucking crossplay.
Yeah.
Like you could play with people on PC and things like Fantasy Star and everything. Like it's
I want to give we'll look up apparently the Quake 3 was like the exception, not the rule. Apparently, ID Software guys were like literal geniuses.
Oh,
like,
yes,
I mean, that's
absolutely.
what they do. Yeah.
So they developed that shit good.
But just the fact that the console was capable of
and
it.
Phantasy Star Online. You can still play Phantasy Star Online today.
Yeah.
There are people who run private servers and have their own broadband modems that they hook up to fucking the Dreamcast.
Yeah,
and
there's
play.
people that because that game also got ported to the GameCube, and it needed the little adapter, and there was people still holding on to that.
All right, that's all I got. That's it.
Special shout out to the I know I mentioned Typing of the Dead, but to that keyboard controller that you plug in.
Yeah, apparently there were 3 tiers with the AT&T internet, and if you subscribe to the unlimited $21 tier, even back then, you would get the keyboard for free with the deal.
I think there was a mouse too, like for the internet.
Yeah, you would
stuff,
get pretty much everything for like
That's
your
so
online
crazy.
gaming.
Yeah, I love the idea of just being like, I gotta go check my email off on the Dreamcast.
I also love that's one of the things I saw. They're like, we only wanted it for email and shit like that. Like, online. What's online gaming?
There was, I forget whatever their puzzle. There was like a puzzle game that you could play that had like leaderboards on it. Like, you know,
I mean, obviously,
like,
eventually it shifted to gaming, but that was the original intention. Like,
but I know, like, you could use that keyboard to like talk to people on Phantasy Star. Like the idea of like a massive MMO being on console, because that predated even the Final Fantasy 11 on PS2 and stuff.
Yeah.
But
well, that's it.
Yeah.
Sega's
that's the tale.
Did
from
all that
beginning
console
to end.
stuff. There you go. Too Long Didn't Read. They made some good ones. They made some bad ones, and then they stopped making them all
I know
together.
to sum it up a little bit, you mentioned this. I think in the beginning of the last episode about how like I know initially we were talking like this was going to be the story of the Dreamcast, but what makes it so interesting is that it's like the Dreamcast had the fate it had and was what it was, all based on prior decisions. So it's like it's almost impossible to sum up the story of the Dreamcast without knowing why what happened business wise.
The Dreamcast is not that different
wise.
from the original Xbox. It's just Microsoft had the money to keep going.
Yeah.
The Dreamcast didn't do that bad.
No, when you hear about
Marketing-wise,
consoles that
like,
fail, I
you know
mean,
what I mean?
like you saw these cheeky stories getting passed around quite a bit. But when it was like something like the Dreamcast outsold the Wii U, but like Nintendo that doesn't affect them. Like you know what I mean? Like
the Wii printed money for them for
exactly,
like forever.
and so did the DS. So it's like
Yeah.
they were fine to come back with with something to try again. But the Dreamcast wasn't the smash hit that I guess they needed to be. And I mean, it pretty much was a smash. It's just it wasn't like.
It wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough to save
really
the
an
company. It
impossible
wasn't enough for
task.
them to keep. They saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
They saw what was going to need to happen to stay in modern gaming, and I think they said, "Well, we've been fumbling around for a while. We had some good ones, bad ones, but I don't think if our marketing can't compete now, how's it supposed to compete against Microsoft and Sony in the future?" You know what I mean?
People remember the Dreamcast very fondly. A lot of the games that started on the Dreamcast that went on to have sequels. A lot of them went to the Xbox or the GameCube. Like Jet Set Radio got a sequel on Xbox. Shenmue got a sequel on Xbox. A lot of
Taxi had a.
there were like 3, I think. Yeah, they had some arcade ones. Soul Calibur, obviously, still going.
Mm-hmm.
But and now Sega, still a pretty notable developer and publisher. Games on all platforms.
They also own Atlas now.
They own Atlas? Holy shit! When was that? That was recent, wasn't it?
Yeah, a couple years ago.
Couple years. All right. And now they are apparently back in the hardware space again with the Genesis Mini.
I think that's being done by somebody else.
It is.
Yeah.
But this is the one that they're officially promoting.
They're working on this because they have a company called AT Games. It's like this Chinese company that makes real shitty hardware things, like the all-in-one joysticks you plug into your TV.
There's so many of those crappy...
Those people made the last Genesis ones, and they're like, no, we're going to make a real Genesis Mini.
Yeah. We'll see how that does.
Mm-hmm.
You bought one. You're
Yeah.
ready.
That's it.
Yep.
And I think that's it. Ooh, that's
Thank you.
the Sega Saga. No, thank you for hosting.
Yeah.
I'm never
was
doing
a
it
lot.
again. It was a nightmare.
Right?
Well, I know. I was so thrilled. I didn't have to do. I didn't have to go through all that history.
Yeah, fuck you.
All right. Let's do some plugs.
Yeah, do some plugs.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more, we got plenty of episodes available, some of which we mentioned in this episode or in part 1. You can find it on Hot Button Cast. All our episodes are available there. It also has links to our iTunes, our Spotify, our Google Play. You can also follow us through links or just through our tag, our handle on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Hot Button Cast. And like and subscribe. No, that's a YouTube thing. Rate us on iTunes. That's
Start
what I
a
meant
cult.
to say.
Starting. You'll host again. It's fun.
Yeah, I'll do it again.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
And we're done.